I started the chapter in, what was it, 1997?
Yeah.
Clark, when I was still at the NutraSweet company. And so at that time, it had a little bit more of a focus on crisis communications, given the fact that the whole sweetener industry had been through an awful lot in its time. I think today there's still a lot of a focus in the chapter on crisis management and issues management, but also more of a focus on some of the more fun aspects of public
Sure,
relations,
yeah.
which is marketing communications. And I can't think of an industry, frankly, that needs communications expertise more than the food and beverage industry.
Yeah, absolutely. In particular today, with all the food regulation that's starting to become even more prevalent, and with the Obama administration and the food bill and food safety law, it is becoming more and more important that companies are able to focus on the issues at hand as it relates to food. And when you think about food, and I think, Rich, you said this originally in the chapter, is that it's a 24/7 situation. You eat every day, and not everyone eats 24 hours a day, but I try. But that's one thing that, is unlike other types of industries, is that this is not something that you only consume when you drive to work, for example. This is something that happens all the time. So it's a different industry because of that, and therefore needs so much more from a public relations communications standpoint. I think just in the past year there have been so many issues, and I think we talked about Japan, and the nuclear incident in Japan that then came ashore to California, which then went across the entire United States. And I don't know if you want to add a little bit more on that, but that was a topic that we really felt needed to be included.
Well, that was one. I think it related to the Fukushima nuclear disaster that happened in 2011, and the fact that there were many reports turned out to be false, but at the
Right.
time they were sort of uncorroborated and frightened people that some milk and some vegetables had been contaminated from radiation that had actually made its way across the Pacific Ocean, which was not the case at all. But it wasn't. It was handled pretty well in the end, and I think managed well. But at the time, it was a kind of a scary moment for some people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this particular situation, because it did impact milk, is probably a very good example. And this was a multifaceted campaign, and one that we had prepared for in advance. Now, you can never write every crisis. And frankly, if someone had told me that there was going to be a tsunami with a hurricane that was going to cause a nuclear issue that was going to potentially come across the United States to our border and impact milk, I would have said that would never happen. Well, it happened. And so we had a multi-pronged effort that was just in general around food crisis and what could happen. And yes, we had our own plans, which were to, and this happened to be in California, and we have plants in California to actually empower our California teams to work with their trade associations in California, plus our national trade associations, as well as get our executive team engaged as well. So it was, there were many pieces to it. The other key thing was getting the government involved. We had a couple, more than a couple actually, phone calls with the FDA, with the USDA, with the EPA. We had separate phone calls. We had a phone call with all of them on the phone and all of affected food companies. And it was really quite interesting because it was because of that type of interest, shall we say, we won't say pressure, interest, that the FDA and EPA made some changes in the way they were approaching the American public because they were so afraid. And that was one example of how we leveraged a crisis plan when it came to food.
I would guess you learned from the spinach crisis from several years back, which was very, very well handled by the Trade Association for the Vegetable Growers, who actually realized that when some spinach had been contaminated with E. coli and people were getting sick, rather than kind of deny or hide or run from the facts, they actually went to the federal government and said, we need your help.
Yep.
And as a result, regulations were improved, but there was a great deal of confidence brought back to the food supply and spinach in particular, and they lost a little bit of market share for a while, but that confidence came back and they handled it so well that it actually improved.
Absolutely. And just one other thing, the interesting thing about that too is that in the food and beverage industry, we seem to learn constantly from these mistakes and continually build on them. And we have, in general, I'd say pretty good relationships within our trade associations, whether it's, Grocery Manufacturers of America or, the International Dairy Food Association or whatever trade association you might be working with. And I think that's a positive thing within the food industry, is that we
agree.
continue to learn.
To an extent, pharmaceutical, I think it's comparable to
another
maybe
one.
the
Yeah.
pharmaceutical
Yeah.
industry.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 And sometimes there's a crossover, again, going back to the realm of sweeteners. NutraSweet, which is generically known as aspartame, was actually kind of discovered by a pharmaceutical company at the time called Searle. And so it had an advantage in that the pharmaceutical industry knows how to deal with the Food and Drug Administration and how to work with the regulatory authorities, and over a period of time managed to get approved as, at the time, it was the most popular, most widely used high-intensity sweetener on the planet. So there's a great deal of crossover, I think, between pharma and food and beverage.
Absolutely. And the other interesting stakeholder for us as well is consumers. We have consumers, we have customers, which, in some cases you just have a consumer. We have multiple layers of stakeholders, B2B. You have, plus you might have distributors, you might have warehouse. There's just any level of a business model, so to speak, in the food industry, and they're very different, and you have to approach them.
Well, I can speak to how we were organized in years past. When Marguerite and I actually worked together, we had an integrated marketing communications team, but we did have people who were specialists. So we had one person in particular who devoted most of her time and energy to dietitians and to the media docs, and managed that channel of communication, if you will. Marguerite really was more of a generalist, working directly with consumers, working with PR agencies, working with our
Marketing
customers
teams, yeah.
and the marketing teams within the company. But we did focus on audiences, and everybody sort of understood which audience was most important to them.
I think it helps. Just enjoying food and liking food and just having an interest in how food comes to market, I think is incredibly, important and valuable. Can you learn it though? Absolutely. Does it help to really have a kind of a passion for it? I think so.
I think so, but I came from the banking industry.
I know you
so
did.
What did I know
That's
about
right.
food, right?
Well, I said that. But you don't have to. Yeah, but I started out as a dietitian, so this was,
Nice.
moving into food and beverage was really my second career, but it's always been my love.
I think
A phrase today that I can't escape in the press, It's,
well, technology drives a lot of the advances in the food industry, and I think with technology comes a certain amount of concern and potential risk. So that's always going to be a factor, I think, in communications related to food and beverage.
Yeah, and a level of responsibility that perhaps in the past we didn't have in the food industry, is because, as you start moving into, more processing and using more technology to do that, you have more responsibility to continue to communicate about your products and what they're about.
good.
Because food, again, it's universal. We all eat and we all drink, and we all have opinions about it.
Yeah,
And
we
there are
do.
so many ways that
Yeah.
consumers can express their views, positive and negative, about the products that come from the food and beverage industry. It's constant vigilance and constant, frankly, interaction and reassurance and persuasion and just flat-out information that helps people make decisions.
There are some really exciting, one of the things that we wrote about in the chapter, in fact, you added, was pop chips. And that was a really interesting, new product that, everybody is really enjoying and consuming. I don't know if you want to describe that a little bit, but that was just no.
I don't know that much more about
No,
pop chips than I
it
can
was-
speak.
Do we have any here?
Yeah, no, they're just, it's just a new technology that they use to create these great chips that have lower calories and lower fat.
Right.
And in, the dairy industry, it sounds really mundane, but we just launched, if you can believe it, a lower fat chocolate milk called Trumu that's going to be national. And as a result, this sounds...
Wait, I want you to repeat the name of it. What's the name?
Trumu.
Trumu, okay, thank you.
Trumu, yes, Trumu, because it's true milk coming from cows.
That's
So
good.
that's what
great.
it is.
That's great.
But the interesting thing is it will be the largest branded milk in the world. And it's just this chocolate milk that has lower fat, no high fructose corn syrup, and no artificial growth hormone. So, it is amazing what you can do, in the food industry, from whether it's in the refrigerated case, in the frozen case, to the juice aisle. There's just, NutraSweet was, if you
It
look,
revolutionized the
it
diet
did,
soda
it did.
industry for sure.
Yeah, it absolutely did, and was exciting to work on too.
It was. There's so much localization going on
Oh,
right
good,
now with
good
the,
point.
the locavores are, demanding more and more that people buy from local farmers, and you have I can't say the word, artisanal cheese?
Yeah, artisanal.
Artisanal
Right.
cheese,
Artisanal
okay.
cheese, yeah.
As one example, and produce coming from local farms. And so it's really interesting. You've got the dynamic of the globalization of the food supply, and yet there's so much more local food available than there ever was before.
Yeah.
And supermarket chains are adapting to that. So every supermarket has its own regional strategy to deal with what is produced in that particular area.
Yeah, it's interesting when you go through the refrigerated aisle or other aisles, and you see the organic section and then the local section, and literally I'm from Texas, so you'll see Texas chilies or Texas pecans or Texas peaches, and I'm sure in Illinois where you're from, that's the same situation. But it really has become a driving trend, and tough, I think, for those of us in the larger companies, because it's harder to deal with that kind of local desire.
It's competition, it's good.
Yes, it's good. It is good. Competition is always good.
I've moved around.
So it's communication that drives
Exactly,
you,
it's communication
right?
as opposed to a particular industry. I
Marguerite,
started
you-
out in political communications,
Right. Talk a
worked
little
in
bit about that.
banking,
Just
worked
Yeah.
in publishing, worked in the food industry. Now I work in manufacturing. So I've been around, but the basic core principles of what we do remain the same regardless of the
What are a
industry.
couple of those core principles that stay with
They're
you?
the Arthur Page principles: telling the truth, being transparent, keeping a sense of humor about what goes on in your world, being sort of in a way, the conscience of the organization that you're working for, and making sure that everybody in the organization is, hopefully aware of some ethical principles that need to be followed, so that the organization can be authentic.
I really, it sort of was something I followed because I loved it.
Yeah.
But
You've been in other foods, right?
I have been in other foods. I worked with NutraSweet. I worked at Quaker Oats, so I worked with Quaker Oats products, particularly Gatorade, which was a fun product to work on. And we should talk about the fun side, actually,
Sure.
at some point.
Yeah, we'll-
And then I went on to work actually in the pharmaceutical industry, but specifically on herbicides, of all things. So it was a different side of the food industry,
Yeah,
more of the
well, sure,
crisis
yeah,
side.
yeah.
But I've pretty much stayed within the food industry. However, I do think that those skills are transferable. I love it. I have a passion for it. But there comes a time in your career where you should look at other options and look at other opportunities. So I'm not afraid to move out of it, but I sure love it now. Okay, so in terms of some of the fun marketing things that are fun, in terms of some of the more interesting and fun marketing public relations things that you can do is really have an impact by leveraging your brand's attributes and by digging deep to find out what is really valued by your consumer. And one of the products that neither Rich and I worked on but found to be really fascinating was the Haagen-Dazs program, where they actually looked at how they could use honeybees, of all things, to support their brand. And honeybees, as you know, go from flower to flower, and also from plant to plant, and also from vegetable to vegetable, and also from fruit to fruit. And they were using fruit in their Haagen-Dazs flavors. So what perfect thing to do but to create a campaign to save the honeybee, which then would save the Haagen-Dazs fruits in their products. And they did this amazing campaign where they incorporated all stakeholders. They went from government, consumers. They had every kind of aspect of the campaign that you can think of to really drive this effort. And it was extremely well received and won awards. I don't know if you want to expound on it.
It really resonated with the audience for Haagen-Dazs, which they had determined was quite, it's upscale, engaged people who are, you know, aware consumers and were concerned about the plight of the honeybee, so it
Right.
worked perfectly for them.
Yep.
Well, I love the example that has been written about before, but when Coca-Cola initially was introduced into the Chinese market, they didn't control very well the expression of the Coca-Cola brand, and so it was often written in Chinese characters in a way that could be broadly misinterpreted by the local distributor of Coca-Cola. And my favorite interpretation of the Chinese characters that were to represent the Coca-Cola brand in China was "bite the wax tadpole." You know, that was a very very bad marketing moment for Coca-Cola. So you have to watch those things pretty carefully.
Well, you know, what I like to do, and Rich, you know, you speak to it too, but have you know, someone in the market.
Right.
Because I just can't understand, and you know,
No, I
it's
agree,
not it's not appropriate, you know, as the head of a function, to pretend to understand every cultural nuance that goes on in a particular country. And for our business in Europe, we have 17 different countries that we are marketed in, and so there's 17 different cultures that we would have to know. So it's much smarter to have somebody who understands that cultural environment that can translate what we're trying to accomplish on a lot of levels.
Yeah. We take the same approach. I'm in the office products industry right now, and the complicating factor for us is that our products are sold in over 100 countries. We have all kinds of language issues that we have to wrestle with, and different brands as well. So we'll make the same product but market it under 2 or 3 different brands depending on the geography. So it requires a lot of coordination and, again, people on the ground in those markets who really know how to address those issues.